Palm Sunday is on April 2nd, but we are going to explore the story of what took place on that day when Jesus entered Jerusalem as the king today. It is one of those 52 key stories in the Bible that form the foundation of our faith and practice that we're looking at this year. And it in particular is one of the 10 key stories that we're going to be looking at between now and the resurrection celebration that we have for Jesus as we celebrate to recall his victory. And we're going to begin by reading the whole story. We read part of it earlier today. We're going to be looking at Luke, the 19th chapter, verses 28 all the way through 48. This is from the New American Standard Bible, maybe a little different than whatever one that you have, but that's okay. After he had said these things, he was going on ahead, going up to Jerusalem, when he approached Bethpage and Bethany, near the mount that is called Olivet. He sent two of his disciples, saying, "Go into the village ahead of you. There, as you enter, you will find a coat tied on which no one yet has ever sat. Untie it and bring it here. If anyone asks you, 'Why are you untying it?' you shall say, 'The Lord has need of it.'" So those who were sent went away and found it just as he had told them. As they were untying the coat, its owner said to them, "Why are you untying the coat?" They said, "The Lord has need of it." They brought it to Jesus, and they threw their coats on the coat and put Jesus on it. As he was going, they were spreading their coats on the road. As soon as he was approaching near the descent of the Mount of Olives, the whole crowd of the disciples began to praise God joyfully with a loud voice for all the miracles which they had seen, shouting, "Blessed is the King who comes in the name of the Lord. Peace in heaven and glory in the highest." Some of the Pharisees in the crowd said to him, "Teacher, rebuke your disciples." But Jesus answered, "I tell you, if these become silent, the stones will cry out." When he approached Jerusalem, he saw the city and wept over it, saying, "If you had known in this day, even you, the things which make for peace, but now they have been hidden from your eyes. For the days will come upon you when your enemies will throw up a barricade against you and surround you and hem you in on every side, and they will level you to the ground and your children within you, and they will not leave in you one stone upon another, because you did not recognize the time of your visitation." Jesus entered the temple and began to drive out those who were selling, saying to them, "It is written, 'And my house shall be called a house of prayer,' but you have made it a robber's den." And he was teaching daily in the temple, but the chief priests and the scribes and the leading men among the people were trying to destroy him. And they could not find anything that they might do, for all the people were hanging on to every word he said. If you didn't know, the church has been celebrating Jesus' triumphal entry into Jerusalem by waving palm branches for a really long time. No one knows exactly when this tradition got started or who organized it, but there is a first original written account in a lady who had gone there, and she wrote a pilgrimage travel. Her name was Agiria, and she wrote this in 381 A.D. She traveled to Jerusalem because she'd heard all the stories of the week-long celebrations that recalled the event of Jesus' life that led up to his resurrection and that final week. And she was amazed. And when she went there and she saw them, she was deeply moved by the worship experience that had taken place there. While she was there on the first day of the week, that is on Sunday, she observed this procession. She was in Jerusalem, and it was coming down, people proceeding, waving palm branches and olive tree branches as they walked down from the Mount of Olives and into Jerusalem with shouts of Hosanna, blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord. At that time, they could still enter into the very same gate that Jesus had gone through. Now, she doesn't mention whether someone was dressed up like Jesus riding on a donkey or not, if they took it that far. But she does know that she didn't see this as a reenactment. She didn't see it as a play that was being performed for an audience. She saw it kind of like we do every year. as taking some palm branches and waving them and remembering through that action what took place as a part of our worship. She saw this as a worship event rather than some play that you might go see. Because of our annual remembrance of Jesus' triumphal entry, you're probably very, very familiar with this story, but you may not realize it until we read it today that Luke's version doesn't mention palms. Did you notice that? They're not in there anywhere. I want you to consider what their absence from Luke's version might mean. If you can tell the story of Palm Sunday without ever mentioning palms, is the waving of palm branches really central to the story? Or is it just that part of the story that captures our attention, it piques our curiosity, it's something that we can grasp hold of, and so we like that? Instead of palm branches, Luke talks about the disciples using their own clothing to drape over the donkey to create sort of a saddle fit for a king, and then they lay it on the ground before him and make a pavement for him to follow. And they're celebrating him as the arrival of a king into Jerusalem. Now, they had a king, they had King Herod, but they didn't have a king that was coming in the name of the Lord. But before we sort of get into the details of the story from Luke's perspective and what we can learn from it, I want to remind you that there are 4 different gospel accounts of Jesus' life. I know this is basic stuff. You know this. You know there's Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. They have a lot of similarities, some more than others, but they also have a lot of differences. And they don't always include the same stories as they tell Jesus' life, but sometimes when we come to this story, all 4 of them give their version of it. And when we find these stories that everyone talks about, sometimes we find some details in them that seem to, well, they don't seem to line up with one another. And there are a lot of people who don't know what to do when that happens. Well, we're going to take this as an example, because if you were to read Matthew's version, you will find that he says that there was a donkey and a colt. There were 2 animals, where Mark and Luke and John only mention the colt. And in Matthew, it actually says that Jesus sat on them. The them, of course, is in reference to the coats. They put their coats on him and he sat on them. It wasn't that he was sitting on 2 donkeys at the same time. But there are some critics who point to that and say, hey, see, the Bible is just full of absurdities. It's saying that these are saying there was only 1, these are saying there were only 2, and Jesus sat on 2 colts. That's unbelievable. This is not historically accurate. But that critique is really just the result of an ambiguity in the English translation that doesn't really reflect what Matthew actually reported when he wrote in his original language. When you find disparities in the gospel accounts, I have found it helpful to sort of imagine the gospel authors are kind of all looking into the same house, but they're looking into it from different windows. And so they're seeing what's going on in the room, and they're all looking from their different perspectives, and then they're telling someone what they're seeing inside there. And each of them are telling a different audience. When you talk to a particular audience about a story, it influences what you will include in that story and what you might leave out, because you're trying to convey the main point of what's going on in there, rather than trying to get all the details to them. For example, when Matthew's audience, the one who talks about 2 donkeys, his audience probably spoke Hebrew or Aramaic at home. And when they were at their religious gatherings, they would have learned the stories of the Old Testament and memorized their scriptures in Hebrew. And they were bilingual, they did speak Greek, but it was their second language. It was their out and about language. It wasn't their heart language. And so Matthew wrote in Greek to them, but he wrote with, let's say, a very Hebraic accent. He emphasized the things that they would relate to. He's talked about it in ways that they would have understood. And his audience would have known Zechariah's prophecy by heart, because it was one of their memory verses, kind of like we teach our children memory verses. this blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord. That this was one of their memory verses. And because it was about the Messiah's arrival. And when you look at Zechariah's one, you'll find that, it does sort of talk about two donkeys. It talks about a mama donkey and a colt, even though only one of them was going to end up getting ridden. So Matthew, in the way he told his story, he was sort of answering an unspoken question about whether this prophecy about the Messiah's entry into Jerusalem was really being fulfilled the way God said it was supposed to be filled. It was very important to them to say, well, was there just one or was there two? Now, most of us, we don't know it that well, so we don't care. In fact, the audiences that Luke and Mark and John wrote to, they didn't know it that well either, and they didn't care. So they just got to the point. Let's just talk about the one that Jesus was riding, the colt. The differences found in the gospel accounts ultimately give us a better understanding of what really took place. And these differences actually lend to the credibility of the Bible rather than detracting from it. And so when you come across them, don't let it throw you off. In fact, there's always a harmony of those differences. There's always a way to say, this is what's going on here. It doesn't mean that our English translations are bad. They're excellent. It just means that sometimes there's translation problems of going from Hebrew or Greek into English. And there could be some of these areas you're going like, oh, what's going on here? So one of the lessons that we need to learn from the story of the Bible is really, the Bible really is the best, most reliable source that we have of what took place back then. Just because Luke doesn't mention palm branches doesn't mean that there weren't palm branches that were being waved that day and used. We got the other ones who said that they were. And just because Luke doesn't mention two donkeys doesn't mean that there weren't two donkeys there. It's just that it wasn't part of the story to the audience that he was telling it to. Probably a better question to ask when you get to the story is, why would Luke leave out a part of the story that seems so very important to everyone else? Why doesn't he mention the palm branches at all? I mean, palm branches are supposed to be a symbol of peace. They had them on their coins. You can find them in all kinds of places. But then again, maybe the palm branches really aren't central to the story of Jesus' triumphal entry as we've been led to believe. Zechariah's prophecy, well, it didn't mention any palms being waved. It didn't mention any coats being laid. Well, why don't I just read it to you? Rejoice greatly, O daughter of Zion. Shout, O daughter of Jerusalem. Behold, your king comes to you. He is just, having salvation, lowly and riding upon a donkey, and upon a colt, the foal of a donkey. You can take that two different ways, right? Of course, most English translators have shied away from anything that might sound like there are two animals in there. So if you were to look up Zechariah 9:9 in a modern English translation, it would say, riding upon a donkey, even the coat of a donkey, because they want to go with the one donkey kind of theory. The important part of this prophecy's fulfillment is that Jesus is coming into Jerusalem as the king. He's coming as the one who's going to be in charge. And that certainly took place. Luke keeps the focus on that part of the story when we read through it. He reminds us that the crowd praised God joyfully with a loud voice for all of the miracles that they had seen. Now that's just one line. It makes me wonder, wow, what kind of miracles were they talking about when they got together? Were they recounting all of Jesus' miracles? Did they have like this litany of all the miracles of the things that Jesus had done? Or was it sort of like what happened whenever John the Baptist was in prison and he was kind of having second doubts? I mean, is Jesus really the Messiah? And he gets his disciples and he sends them to go and ask Jesus, hey, Jesus, are you really the Messiah? And Jesus says, go back and tell John, the blind receive sight, the lame walk, lepers are cleansed, the deaf hear, the dead are raised up, and the poor have good news preached to them. I think it's kind of that list. I think there's this list of the miracles. They're looking at Jesus and they're saying, man, you remember all the things he's done over these last 2 years. He's walked on water. He's fed 5,000. All the miracles that we see in Jesus' life. He's healed the lame. has given sight to the blind. He can do impossible. What's the explanation? It's got to be that he's the Messiah. He's got to be the one that God is sending to us to do things that no one else can do. One of the dead who had been raised up was Lazarus. He happened to live in the city of Bethany, which was where the donkeys had been taken from. I know you picked up that part of the story. And Luke reminds us in his version that many of those who were in the city of Jerusalem, when they hear the disciples coming and they're bringing Jesus and they're shouting and they're bringing him in as the king, they're going around in Jerusalem and they're trying to get everyone they can to come out and to greet the king who's coming in the name of the Lord. To greet this king who's coming in peace. Now sometimes we don't grasp that very well. He's coming to make their lives better. Their word shalom, their word for peace, is well-being. It's not just the absence of war, but it's life better. A king who's coming to save them from their troubles and their worries and their hardships and being taken advantage of. All the things in life that we want to get away from, they want to get away from. There's this king who says, hey, I'm going to come and make your life better. I'm going to save you from the things that are going on. And that's a whole lot better than a king coming to your city back then who was coming under his own might, who was coming to destroy, who was coming to tear down your walls and either kill you or enslave you. And that happened a lot. And it would happen. Jesus knew it was going to happen, right? Now, I'm sure you remember how the story began. Jesus just did something that normal people can't do. All of the gospel writers mention that Jesus knew what was going to happen before it happened. Remember those two disciples that he sends into Bethany? You know, they're close to Bethany, Bethpage. One's on either side of the road. They go into Bethany, we know from the other gospel writers. He talks to them about these donkeys, exactly where they're going to be, what's going to happen, even that people are going to interrupt you when you're getting them, and what to say to them. He knows what's going to happen before it happens, and he tells the disciples what's going to happen before it happens. And I think that's an important part of this story. I think we can learn something about Jesus from that, because these guys are kind of surprised that Jesus knew what he was talking about. It was one more way that they could say, hey, Jesus is doing a God thing. I mean, it wasn't on the level of raising someone up from the dead. But how many people you know really know the future? They really know about things in other places. That's a God kind of thing. Another important part of the story is that when Jesus tells them to go, they're obedient. They don't know there are any donkeys there. They don't know if they're going to find them or they're not going to find them. They just say, hey, Jesus, we trust you. You tell us to go, we're just going to go do it. And along the way, they find out, hey, Jesus knew what he was talking about. I think we can take something from that. When we come to Jesus' commands to us, I think Jesus knows what he's talking about. I mean, even if you just take the simple ones, right? Hey, love God, love your neighbor as yourself. Have you ever, God, you want me to go love my neighbor? Really? You know my neighbor's God? Well, he probably knows your neighbor. He probably knows in advance. He probably knows what's going to happen when you go and try to express some love. He knows that. You just need to trust him and go try it. Go do it. And you might be surprised that Jesus knows what he's talking about. We learn in Luke's version of Jesus' triumphal entry, his coming in as king, that it was more than just the 12 who are referred to as Jesus' disciples. We shouldn't be surprised by that. He said there's this whole crowd of disciples. The word disciple was their word for a learner, a student, a follower. Being a disciple did not mean that a person was following Jesus for the right reasons, or that they had the right understanding of who he was, or they were going to be a lifelong learner. A disciple simply meant that they were learning about God from Jesus at that moment in their life. Now, we use the term disciple quite differently today, don't we? When we say that someone is a disciple of Christ, We mean that they are believers who have confessed Jesus as their Lord, who've made them the king of their life. They've repented of their sins. They've been united with him in baptism. They've received his Holy Spirit. They're living for him. That's usually what we mean when we say disciple. But that's not what they meant back then. Jesus was just using this word, or Luke was using this word to describe people who had a relationship with Jesus, who had an understanding. They were trying to follow him, but they really didn't understand what kind of king he was. They followed Jesus because of the sort of king they wanted him to be. And they would soon abandon Jesus because Jesus wasn't the kind of king they wanted. People are still disappointed with King Jesus whenever he turns out to be a rather different king than the one they expected. Hey, Jesus, I'm going to follow you if you get me out of this mess. I got this trouble, and you just sort this thing out for me, then I'll follow you forever. And Jesus is saying, man, I want to bring forgiveness into your life. I want to bring a change into your life, and so that you become a person of love who cares about the people around you. You may not get the stuff that you want. You know, it may not bring the healing that you prayed for. He may not help in the ways that you expected. He's really not a celestial bellhop that we just sort of bang on the bell until, he does what we want. Now, later on in our study of these stories that lead up to the resurrection, we're going to recall that time when Jesus was examined by Pilate to see if he'd done anything worthy of death. And he asked Jesus point blank, are you really a king? And Jesus affirms that he is. But he says, but my kingdom is not of this world. He is king. I don't know what your relationship is in regard to King Jesus. And I bring that up because Jesus entered Jerusalem as the triumphant king. And by the end of the week, he departs as a victorious king. Now, there are a lot of people, when they look at Jesus' last week, not really his last week, right? It continues, but the last week before his death, burial, and resurrection, there are a lot of people that see that, hey, man, they welcome him in. He came in. He's this great king. Blessed is he who comes in the name. Lord, come save us. He comes in and, man, the powers that be take hold of him and put him to death. End of story. That's kind of how a lot of people see it. But we understand that Jesus is victorious. He comes into Jerusalem as this expected king, and he does exactly what he says he's going to do in advance of doing it. He comes in and he defeats death on the cross. He raises up in resurrection to give us a hope of eternal life. He is victorious. I tell you what, I kind of get a little irritated with people going like, I can't wait for Jesus to come back on a white horse. He's going to come back as the reigning, victorious king. And I'm going like, did you not read the gospel? He's already victorious. He went to Jerusalem. He won the victory. It's done. It's time to celebrate. The crowd of disciples, when they're welcoming Jesus into Jerusalem, use Psalm 118 to do so. Now, we just get a snippet in Luke, just a little portion of Psalm 118. Again, this would have been part of their memory work stuff. They would have had it, man, we're using it. Now we understand how to use it. You see, they used Psalm 118 to define the kind of king that Jesus was. He's the kind of king whose loving kindness lasts forever. He's the kind of king to whom you can call on in your distress and he will answer. He's the kind of king that if he is with you, then there is no one whom you should fear. He's the kind of king to whom the gates of righteousness will be thrown open that he might enter into them. He's the kind of king that is like a stone that the builders reject but becomes a chief cornerstone. He's the kind of king who reminds us that this is the day the Lord has made, so let us rejoice and be glad in it. He's the kind of king to whom we can say, Lord, save us. Hosanna. Save us now. You may not realize, but Hosanna, the na on the end of a Hebrew word means now, please, now. It's a pleading addition. We don't have an ending for a word that we have in English that way. But they're saying, save us, please. Please. Save us now. We need it now. He's the kind of king who will save us because he's good. That's what Psalm 118 says. But the end of Psalm 118 hints at how this coming king is going to bring victory. It seems like an odd, out-of-place thing when you read it in Psalm 118, but it makes perfect sense when you apply it to Jesus. The last part of Psalm 118 says, bind the festival sacrifice with cords to the horns of the altar. We know what that means. Jesus is the kind of king who sacrifices himself so that we can be forgiven, who takes our punishment on so that we can be set free. He's that kind of king. We also learn from Luke's version that some of the Pharisees are looking at this unfold and seeing the kind of king that these people are saying that Jesus is, and they're saying, hey, hold on here, time out. This is all wrong. You're just manipulating everything here. I mean, you're the one who got the donkey. You're the one who got these people all riled up. You're letting them worship you like God. No. You need to confront these guys, settle them down, and bring an end to this, Jesus. And Jesus explains to them that since his praise on that day is a God thing, and it's God arranged rather than a people thing, that if he silenced the crowd, then even the rocks, the stones would cry out. That is, God was going to make this thing happen, and there was nothing they could do about it. I'm sure you know that Jerusalem was built on a rock. I mean, the whole place where Jerusalem was built was just this great, big, huge rock of a mountain. And they built Jerusalem out of the rock. They had to use timbers and things as well to support stuff, but it's a big rock fortress. And some Bible scholars believe that when Jesus said the rocks will cry out, he was referring to Habakkuk chapter 2. That's where God raised up a prophet to confront the leaders of God's people, to remind them that they were not going to get away with their shady dealings. They had been making deals where those leaders were profiting and the people were just getting oppressed and poorer. He raised up this prophet and said, your violent ways aren't going to last. You're not going to get away with it. They were abusive to the people to the point that they wouldn't even raise up their voice in prayer to say, God, do something about this. They were so afraid of reprisal. And in Habakkuk 2, God reveals to the prophet who says, hey, the rocks are crying out to me. You're not going to get away with this. Even the rocks are letting me know that these people need to be saved. And I think that's part of what Jesus was talking about. I can't silence these people. God knows they need to be saved. And if they don't raise their voices in shouts of, save me now, then the rocks would cry out as witness against you, who are no longer leading them toward God, but are a problem, and you're in the way of it. So they welcomed Jesus as king because they were hurting. They needed relief from their suffering. These people really had been taken advantage of. They'd been under suppression by the authority, and they needed someone exactly like Jesus. Now, on the other side of the coin of Jesus being aware of what's going to happen before it happens, Luke tells us that Jesus is overwhelmed by what he knows is going to happen. This crowd of disciples are going to turn away from him. Jerusalem is going to turn away from him. And it's going to be destroyed. He sees in advance its destruction. And it breaks his heart. Luke recalls that as he approaches the city, that is, as he's in this procession that's all around him and celebrating him, he looks onto the city. And if you were over there and you were to do hikes, it would be kind of like being on the ski area and looking down onto Los Alamos. About that kind of a distance and height advantage. And he's looking kind of a panoramic view of the city. and his heart's broken before he ever gets there. Now, there are some people that say that Luke's description is so detailed that there's no way it could have been written in advance, that this had to be written later. And so they say all these Gospels, they had to be written way after 70 AD because that's when this destruction took place, and it would never have been in the Bible if it wasn't written later. But we know Jesus knows things in advance. He's weeping in advance. Truth is, Jesus just knew what was going to happen. Just as he knows what's going to happen with you. And he's grieving because even though he comes and he brings victory, and even though he makes the offer for salvation that they're crying out for, they won't turn to him from it, and they will suffer the consequences as a result of it, just like you'll suffer consequences if you don't turn to him. It seems odd to conclude this story with the cleansing of the temple. But it's really not just the money changers that he's chasing out. It's this whole religious system that's been abusive to people and making them suffer to the point that they need salvation that Jesus has come to save them from. Their sins, but also everything else that's going on. I hope that the church, and in particular our church, never ends up getting in the way between people and God. I hope that we never end up suffering people or persecuting people or pushing people away or becoming a burden to people's lives. I hope that we are always known as Jesus wants us to be known, by our love, that we are known by our grace, that we're known by our mercy. And the only way for that to happen is to let Jesus really be Lord, to let him be King of our lives. We're going to use a hymn of invitation, and I want you to use it as a time of celebration, a time of saying, okay, God, I want you really to be King of my life, and I want to celebrate that you come into my life with victory. Would you please stand?